we have this tendency to want to tie everything back to IDP and SSO, but your IDP and your SSO can absolutely be weaponized against you. They can be used to either A, insert additional access, or B, deny everyone access. And so your out-of-band communications capability, while it may rely on some of those in-band technologies, for initial onboarding when you are not in the midst of an incident, it actually needs to be able to solve for onboarding during a crisis. And in-crisis onboarding looks different.
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Defenders Podcast, where we talk to the people who keep the internet safe. These industry experts share their innovative cyber defense technologies, vital insights into threats, and predictions for the future of cybersecurity. My name is Christopher Luft. I'm one of the co-founders of LimaCharlie, and I will be your host. This podcast is brought to you by LimaCharlie, maker of the SecOps Cloud platform, infrastructure for SecOps where everything is built API first. Scale with confidence as your business grows. Start today for free at limacharlie.io. Now let's get into it.
My guest today is Navroop Mitter, the CEO of ArmorText, a mobile security and privacy startup specializing in out-of-band communication based in Washington, D.C. Prior to founding ArmorText, Navroop was a senior manager in Accenture's North American security practice, where he led major international security initiatives, built security practices in emerging markets, and specialized in identity and access management. He played a key role in expanding Accenture's security presence in Scandinavia and helped establish a nearshore security delivery center in Argentina. At ArmorText, he continues to focus on secure out-of-band communications for enterprise use cases such as incident response and threat intelligence sharing. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, Navroop. It's a real honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me on.
So I'm always interested in how people found a career in cybersecurity and technology, what that journey was like. How did you find your way to where you are today?
Truthfully, almost accidentally. I had been in a series of startups in parallel to attending high school and even during college. But fast forward to my senior year, and it was 9/11. I was involved in so many activities outside of the university that I'd actually forgotten to apply to jobs. Happened to attend the right recruiting dinner, by accident sat by someone who I thought was another student, and while chatting with her, actually discovered that she was A, super friendly, but B, a recruiter for IBM. And when I got pulled into an interview the very next day at our student center with what I thought was going to be her, but it actually ended up being her boss, they quickly asked me to fly down to New York, take a whole series of tests. I thought they were recruiting me for a position in an internal lab doing research at, say, Watson. And it ended up actually being recruiting for part of their consulting practice. And so my segue into security was actually because one of the products I got thrown on early on was a security project. It was not something I initially chose, not something I was originally concerned with. IBM had just bought another security product. And about 30, 60 days in, the majority of the folks that had come along with the acquisition actually left, aside from the engineers. And suddenly I was one of the few people who had actually trained with the folks that had come over with the acquisition. And so I rapidly got asked to figure out how to both stand up the product, figure out how to make it work at client sites, and then also how to help some of the principals actually sell it to others. And that kicked off my entire cybersecurity career.
Wow, so trial by fire.
Literally trial by fire. Yeah, we made more than a few mistakes along the way, but had some amazing successes. And because of that, it rapidly accelerated my tenure in consulting. I moved through the ranks much faster than I think I otherwise would have, got new opportunities, including traveling to Scandinavia and Argentina and other places in South America much earlier than I otherwise would have. It really helped the career blossom in a whole different way, very unexpectedly.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I remember early in my career, I worked for a very small startup, and within 4 months of starting, the CTO and one of the founders left, and I all of a sudden found myself in way over my head, and probably learned more in those following months than at any other point in my career. So,
yeah, it's amazing what those opportunities allow you to do if you're willing to step up to the plate
and stick it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, generally as a rule around here, we don't do product pitches on the show, but I think the problem you guys are trying to solve is really interesting, and I don't see how we can really talk about it without looping your product into it. So maybe you can start by telling us what ArmorText does, and then we can talk about all the reasons why this problem is important to try and solve.
Yeah, happy to. So ArmorText solves for out-of-band communications, particularly for things like incident response, security operations, and threat intelligence sharing. If you think about breaches, when they take place, there's a high likelihood that your communications are going to be surveilled. So much so that when you think about even breaches of larger companies who themselves even provide some of the day-to-day communications technologies that we all use, like a Microsoft, they, in their 8K filing in March of 2024, discussed an incident where their networks had been breached, and where in the 8K filing, I think this is even like sentence 2, they revealed that the communications of their own cybersecurity and legal professionals were actually surveilled during the breach. And so it kind of begs the question, right? If a Microsoft, who otherwise provides for your day-to-day communications, is saying that during a breach, even they could not protect their own people on top of their own platforms during a breach of their own networks, what should you be looking to do? Because those everyday channels then are very likely to be compromised.
So how do attackers exploit in-band communication? Like, if they can surveil it, like, what do they do with it if they have that visibility while the incident's taking place?
Yeah, it's a number of things. Number one, it's highly likely they're going to be monitoring for discovery. They want to know if you've already found out where they are in your systems and networks. They want to look at your remediation efforts to try and stay ahead of you. It may be to inform future attacks. But in the case of, like, say, for example, ransomware, one of the things they're going to be looking at is your ransomware negotiation strategy. They might be looking at your documentation and understanding what you're allowed to pay up to, and then making demands accordingly. And if they're able to monitor the chats in which you're having discussions around how much you're willing to pay, they can actually interrupt that conversation and say, no, look, we are well aware. We are telling you that we are not going to accept lower this amount. We clearly see what it is you're attempting to do. So there are lots of kinds of things they're going to be monitoring for, right? They might be monitoring for information around vulnerabilities that you cannot patch, or systems that are not going to be able to be addressed right now, things that they can further embed themselves on. And so just quite a few activities that they're going to be looking for.
So, like, at what point of incident, like, we just discovered maybe something's going on, we don't know what the impact is yet. Like, at which point does this out-of-band communication become critical? Like, when do we do the switch over if we're going to take this route?
That's a great question, right? So realistically, it was critical some 200, 300, 400 days prior to discovery, because there's a high likelihood that your adversary was actually on the network and surveilling communications for quite some time. Reconnaissance is part of the game. And so there's a high likelihood that you should have actually been more proactively protecting security operations. But certainly once you know that you have been breached, or you suspect a compromise, or you suspect a weaponization of your IDP, or you've had some sort of outage, you absolutely need to cut over to your out-of-band communications almost immediately, because there's a high likelihood that they're going to be surveilling you and using whatever they learn against you.
It's interesting. I kind of feel like there's an opportunity to have a disinformation channel and then have the real communication taking place out of bounds.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. Almost like a honeypot, right? It's actually something we often talk about, is even the kind of telemetry you would get off of a normal honeypot. The need is to actually deliver that itself out of band to the appropriate parties, so that the adversary doesn't know that they've tripped a honeypot, right? If you were sending that kind of information straight into the SIM, they might become aware of that. And so, very much to your point, it might be interesting to actually purposely stand up a honeypot IR discussion taking place on your in-band tools, while simultaneously having the real conversations in your out-of-band dedicated platform.
And what makes something like text not sufficient for this kind of thing? Like, we have lots of different channels that we communicate across. Why do we need a purpose-built tool for this?
Yeah, that's another great question. When I've explained this to others, I will oftentimes first start with just saying that, look, we have this tendency to believe that any alternative to our normal communications lines could, in theory, be our out-of-band channel. But I don't think anyone would ever argue that smoke signals or 2 tin cans on a string were the right solution for enterprise going through incident response. Likewise, when you think about, like, texting, whether it's SMS or a WhatsApp or an iMessage, the reality is they are missing fundamental controls that an enterprise needs. Things like user management, policy enforcement, or even records retention. For many enterprises, especially regulated ones, or those operating critical infrastructure, there are oftentimes business records retention requirements. And so that often leaves organizations having to, either tell their people that you have to proactively take screenshots or post an incident to having to collect devices and do imaging of the devices. There's a number of things that go wrong when you don't have dedicated tools. Coming back to like the user management side of the house, if you don't have controls on who can speak with whom, you wind up with situations like our friend Pete, who accidentally added the wrong reporter to the conversation. Or you wind up in situations where like these two mobile security companies back in the day, one had actually adopted WhatsApp for its internal executive communications, and an executive actually left that company to go to a competitor. And for the next 1 year, the competitor kept beating that other company to market by about a week or two at a time. And they could never quite figure out why. And it turns out when that executive left, they were removed from the channels where some of the other senior leaders knew that they were. But there were a whole set of other channels in which they were still embedded that no one had actually gone back and audited the entire list of the 50, 60, 70 participants, however long it was, to figure out whether or not they were there as well. And so when you don't have appropriate user management and centralized controls for that, you can't actually ensure that the wrong parties are now removed from all conversations. They could very well be resident ones where it's just not being looked at. When it comes to some of your other enterprise controls requirements like policy enforcement, you absolutely need to meet the obligations you've got day to day during a crisis. Regulations like an NYDFS still say that your operational controls need to be in place even when things are going wrong. And that also includes, again, business records retention.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, and like the user control, the account control, that's definitely something we see with like API keys and all kinds of access management tokens that just kind of get forgotten and sort of washed up in the daily churn, right? So what qualifies as truly out-of-band communication, and how's that different between like a secure alternate Slack or something like that that's internal to our current process?
That's right. So let's say you already have a Slack or something like that, and you just want to have an alternate of the same thing. Let's say that the issue that led to the breach of the communications you're having on your day-to-day Slack is something that's actually systemic, and it actually means that your alternative Slack may also be down or easily compromised as well. That would be a problem, right? The characteristics that you would want to look for an actual out-of-band communication system, something that's going to provide you the ability to have secure out-of-band communications for things like incident response, where the stakes are higher, are one that it actually needs to be out-of-band. It can't be a duplicate of an in-band tool. It should be completely independent of any network dependencies or any infrastructure dependencies on your end. It needs to be more secure. You don't want simply just yet another username and password standing between you and your attacker and their ability to surveil your communications. You want the protections of things like properly implemented end-to-end encryption, which can help stave off both insider threats as well as additional third-party risk. You then also want to make sure that it can still help you deliver against those controls requirements we were just discussing, right? Does it have your user and policy controls? Does it allow you to have your business records retention? But does it allow for that in a way that doesn't, again, reintroduce a dependency on your network? Because if it reintroduces a dependency on your network and your network is down or compromised, well, great, your quote-unquote out-of-band solution is no longer out-of-band and no longer viable.
Yeah, I guess if the network's down and it's on the network, there's nothing about it that's going to save you.
Hey, it's Nicole from the LimaCharlie marketing team. Many security teams deal with tool sprawl, dozens of different solutions that create gaps in visibility and slow down response times. Our SecOps Cloud platform consolidates your security stack into a unified platform where everything works together. LimaCharlie gives you comprehensive endpoint visibility and automated response capabilities in milliseconds instead of minutes, so you can stop threats before they spread across your environment. Try our scalable infrastructure for your security services for free at limacharlie.io.
You mentioned access control is one of the requirements for one of these out-of-band communication tools. What's the checklist look like for things that IR teams should be looking for in something like this?
Yeah, interesting enough, it actually is a bit of the inverse of your day-to-day situations, right? So day-to-day, we have this tendency to want to tie everything back to IDP and SSO, but your IDP and your SSO can absolutely be weaponized against you. They can be used to either A, insert additional access, or B, deny everyone access. And so your out-of-band communications capability, while it may rely on some of those in-band technologies, for initial onboarding when you are not in the midst of an incident, it actually needs to be able to solve for onboarding during a crisis And in-crisis onboarding looks different. It can't be dependent on your domain. Potentially your email domains and any confirmations being sent there are being surveilled. Can't rely on the IDP because if that's weaponized, well, you don't want to have that connected to your out-of-band communications tool, lest they use that weaponization to actually deny you access to that tool when you need it most, right? And so the rules of kind of zero trust and access and everything else tend to invert themselves a bit during a crisis.
So how do you ensure people have access when the pressure's on and the thing happens, if they can't just reset their password via email and whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you want to choose tools that are specifically designed for in-crisis operations, and that means they solve for in-crisis onboarding. They've got either some sort of admin-assisted onboarding or some sort of code-based onboarding that does not tie back to the email, the ability to immediately divorce yourselves from that standard set of processes, password reset mechanisms that then won't necessarily rely on that, while still at the same time allowing you to continue to operate at scale and at speed. And so there's a lot of technical depth there, and we can totally go into that, but then we turn into a very long product pitch where I'd be talking about all the different onboarding mechanisms that we've solved for. There's an additional 3-4 that we've solved for that are in crisis specific. You can use them day to day too, but generally speaking, organizations that are our customers use those as their in crisis onboarding mechanisms. And that's part of what sets us apart from a lot of the general communications tools. Yeah, you could use something that wasn't built for a crisis in times of crisis, but if it's dependent on your email domain or some sort of other self-service mechanism that ties back to that, it's probably not appropriate for those scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take us too far off the road for too long, but I am fascinated by this. Like, you think of an incident going down and maybe you've got to loop somebody in that's not normally in that sort of communications path, and you need to get them on board, but you can't use their email. And how do we get them securely onto this tool? Like you said, you solved for 3 or 4 use cases. Can you just maybe talk about that one a little?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you one example, right? We have an admin-assisted onboarding mechanism whereby admins can actually help create the appropriate credentials for parties. You can then use an external identity verification capability to ensure that as that person uses the credentials you created for them, it is indeed the right person actually using them and signing up. This is something we're doing in partnership with Clear. You have sign-up code-based approaches that can also similarly draw you in to your organization's private directory on our platform. One of the mechanisms there is to then securely distribute a sign-up code to individuals who need to be onboarding. You might then ask them to use a personal email as opposed to an admin-assisted account, created account where an email wasn't necessary at all. But there are a handful of other mechanisms as well, too. Mm-hmm. There's a couple that are coming, and which is why I'm trying to not go too far into what we're getting ready to announce there, because they're not public yet. They're kind of in closed beta, but yeah, there's a few other mechanisms on the way.
It kind of sounds like human in the loop is a part of that kind of workflow to make sure it stays secure in that kind of crisis situation, though.
Absolutely. Human in the loop is so critical in those crisis scenarios. Yes, you want to do things to help automate and rapidly, get people onboarded and at scale. But even when you're doing that with that, for example, the out-of-band identity verification, we were just talking about this in a webinar we had with the Clear One folks. You're doing it, but you're also throwing up additional data from that Clear One verification, such that a human in the loop admin on ArmorText could actually look at that in parallel to the person's ArmorText onboarding and make a decision as to whether or not to finally grant this person full privilege in the environment, or to have them maintain that kind of effectively purgatory state where they have limited access to the environment. They have the ability to be seen, but not to see others who are onboarded, so they can be pulled into conversations, but themselves can't do more, right? Mm-hmm. That preliminary access that they would be granted, you can actually maintain them, or the human in the loop decision maker can say, oh yeah, actually, wait a minute, this actually is Chris, or this is John, but something doesn't feel right based on the type of device they use to complete their verifications. We're going to go ahead and suspend their account or delete them, right? And so there are a lot of reasons why, especially in a crisis, human loop decision making is critically important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, if I'm a big enterprise organization that's barely keeping security running because we're tight on budget and all the things that everybody deals with, how do we prepare in advance for a smooth switch over to using out-of-bound communications in the event of a breach?
It all comes down to practice, right? And muscle memory. At the end of the day, you've got to know your playbook cold. If you don't, you're liable to make mistakes, or people are liable to revert back to the shadow IT you were trying to prevent in the first place, right? So It's not enough to just buy a tool, put it on the shelf. You actually need to run tabletop exercises that specifically, highlight the concerns with the in-band technologies, and make people more aware of the risks of using them, but then B, also help practice the cutover to your out-of-band comms capabilities and then the appropriate use of those. And so if you're looking for those kinds of tabletop exercises or injects, interestingly enough, for the last 2 years, we've actually been writing guides that we've open sourced with the help of Crowell and Mooring. These tabletop exercise guides create a handful of scenarios that we release each year that themselves are accompanied by injects. And some of those injects actually include communications injects. And oftentimes they'll be taking a look at some of the scenarios we were just talking about, right? You're relying on your WhatsApp, some executive leaves, or, kind of like what Pete did here. They're using their personal signal and they loop the wrong person in. Or there are injects around what goes wrong when you continue to communicate on your existing platforms. And so that whole set of tabletop exercises is made freely available. It's actually issued on a Creative Commons license on purpose so that you can actually reuse it and remix it with other tabletop exercises. We've heard a lot of parties say they've actually taken the injects, or especially around the comms, and then actually worked those into the normal exercises they were planning to run anyways, or they handed it off to the IR tabletop practitioners that are going to be coming in to run their next exercise and told them, hey, find a way to kind of cover these same topics. Even if we have to rewrite the inject, come up with something that's substantially similar so we actually get the practice we need, both to help show our people why this is absolutely necessary, but B, then how to do the cutover appropriately.
Oh, that's awesome. And we always provide links to resources in the show notes, so we'll make sure to make those available to anybody listening.
Awesome.
So beyond IR, is there other places in security operations or governance where out-of-band communications prove valuable?
Yeah. I already mentioned one of those use cases. It's security operations. If you think about it, the reality is you were probably being surveilled for some 200 days prior to discovery. And so given that, there's a lot of day-to-day use cases there around vulnerability management, discussion around patches, security operations, but also threat intelligence sharing. Depending on the kinds of sectors you're in, there's a high likelihood you're part of a threat intelligence sharing network. And if you really want to make the best use of the collective brain power there, you need a platform that you can both trust with the security of those communications, as well as trust in the identities of whom you're communicating with, so that you can have much more open and honest discussions around what you're seeing, the mitigation strategies that are necessary. You can get kind of that mutual assistance going. And so threat intelligence sharing networks are another one. But also increasing what we're seeing is executive SLT and board communications, right? Where they're actually saying, hey, look, we actually need effectively a classified tier in parallel to our unclassified tier. And they start to treat the day-to-day in-band technologies as that unclassified tier, and then treating their out-of-band communications technology that's already been vetted for this additional security as their out-of-band tier. As their classified tier. And so that's actually another set of use cases. There are a handful of others, but those are the big ones. Yeah,
the insider's threat on the last one kind of makes a lot of sense to me. Board needs to have communications they don't want rippling out into the world. IT teams see emails and all kinds of things that maybe they're not supposed to in certain scenarios. So
absolutely,
makes a ton of sense.
There's actually an example of I think it was a travel related company that had one of its own IT workers monitoring the communications of the CFO and the board ahead of earnings calls, so that they could actually, using those communications, monitor the market accordingly, right? And so there's a number of those kinds of incidents. There's also others where you had, executive assistants or other assistants is a part of the network who had access to an executive's email actually being the source of information that was then leaked to reporters and others. And so the more sensitive the communications, the higher the stakes are, the more likely you are to need to apply a tier and protect strategy to communications, creating kind of a day-to-day unclassified tier and a classified tier. And that's a strategy that's borrowed from defense and intelligence. They've long operated this way, right? If you're in the U.S. defense, sector, you are probably familiar with NIPR, SIPR, and JWICs. Think of us as JWICs for the private sector, or the classified tier for the private sector.
Yeah, have you seen increased interest from the boards and stuff like that, given, just the heightened awareness of security and what's at stake with this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Both because of the heightened awareness around security, but also because there has been a push from regulators and other bodies globally to tell boards that they have increased oversight responsibilities for both cybersecurity as well as incident response. And so as a result of this, new awareness that's being pushed on them, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we actually do need to get better at this ourselves. We don't want to get caught with our pants down. And in some cases, it's because they know there are penalties that can be applied if they were found to be having been negligent under the requirements for those different new laws or regulations that are coming into place. So yeah, quite a bit of actually additional interest from boards themselves, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the kind of the normal board book technologies that are out there, these technologies generally don't imply some sort of end-to-end encryption for the communications. Rather, they are just as open as anything else, and oftentimes they're actually backing into your email itself. And so you do want something that has greater security for those most sensitive discussions.
It's fascinating. I love how this industry just continues to evolve and change. And, I have a little bit of the ADHD, and I think this will keep me busy for the rest of my life. So.
You and me both.
Yeah, I think it's a common trait in this industry. The last one I have for you, it's the same question I ask of everybody that comes on the show. It can be as wide or as narrow as you want. Do you have any predictions for the future of cybersecurity?
So there's a prediction I've been saying for the last couple of years, and I think it still holds true, and it's because we're still on an upward swing. I think there's an increased emphasis on post-breach resilience, and that's only going to continue. For the longest time, whether it's the companies, who are the end users or customers of these technologies, the vendors themselves, or even the venture capitalists who finance them, so much of the emphasis was on prevention, making sure no one got in the first place. We used to actually see this come up even from CIOs. You would have a CISO who wanted to adopt a technology like ours because they knew they needed out-of-band communications for an incident, and they didn't want to be turning to a consumer application that might leave them, on the wrong side of their own general counsel internally, even for not having met the appropriate controls. They would go to the CIO and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. And oftentimes budget would be denied, and they would be simply told, look, if you were doing your jobs right in the first place, you wouldn't need a tool like this. So either go do your jobs better or figure out how to better protect the day-to-day tools we already have. And I think now what we're increasingly seeing is that CIO who was once a blocker is increasingly turning into an ally because they themselves are aware that the probability of an incident arising where you're going to need some sort of secure out-of-band communications is now a probability of 1. And as a result, they themselves are saying, hey, we need to have better post-breach resilience. And so I think you're going to start to see more invested time and energy on the behalf of customers, but also then the vendors and also the VCs who finance them.
Awesome. I love it. I do a summary of all the predictions at the end of the year, and I finally have one that's not about AI, so thank you.
We've got my one about AI too. We'd happily talk about that. I actually think this is more interesting, right? Because I've started 100 AI predictions. They're relatively
yeah, totally. And it's like, it's going to be a thing. We all know that, but I don't think anybody knows.
I'll give you another one there if you want on the AI side. I'll give you one.
Sure.
It might be a little counter to what some of the folks are saying. I think we're going to continue into this AI arms race, right? We've got this arms race, especially around the deepfake detection technologies. Right now, what we're seeing is there's a study I'm going to butcher the name of the university, so I'm not going to say it in its full form, but SKKU out of South Korea in collaboration with the Australians. What they found was 0 out of the 16 deepfake detection technologies they tested at the top end of the market were able to reliably detect a deepfake in the wild. In the lab, perfectly fine, but in the wild, they weren't reliable. And I think that arms race is only going to continue. And so you're going to start to see a movement towards adopting more analog and or potentially even like Cold War era spy novel inspired techniques for things like identity verification, alongside then adoption of things like what we're doing for out-of-band identity verification with our partner Clear, so that you can actually start to vet identity appropriately through means that, frankly, aren't really worried about whether or not the deepfake detection technologies can keep up with the ability to produce better and better deepfakes.
Yeah, and I think you're bang on there. I think proving who you are on the internet will become more and more of a thing in the near future. We've just seen how bots are wrecking everything, and with the rise of AI, just if we want to continue to use this as a productive tool that makes society better, we're going to have to know who's on there. And yeah, it sucks losing some of the anonymity stuff, but I think it's better overall for everybody.
Absolutely.
All right, Navroop, thank you so much. This was a really interesting conversation. I'm sure it's giving lots of our listeners something to think about. If they want to find out more, get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, ArmorText.com, ARMORTEXT.com, not to be confused with the British spellings of armor or armor. We are not the love company. It is armor, ARMORTEXT.com. And from there, you can either reach me or other members of our team to get any kind of help you need.
Awesome. It was great talking to you. We'll see each other soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the next time. Thanks for having me on.
Take care.
And that brings us to the end of another great conversation. You can support our show by sharing your favorite episode with a friend, subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. If you want to be part of the conversation, you can join our community forum at community.limacharlie.io. Thanks for listening in, and we'll see you on the next one. The Cybersecurity Defenders Podcast is hosted and produced by Christopher Luft. The show is co-produced and edited by Sam Blake with graphics by Amr Al-Khatib. Sponsored by LimaCharlie, scalable infrastructure for your security services. Visit limacharlie.io to get started for free.